Yo, so guys, welcome back to part two of this reaction. We're back at 2 minutes after. And I mean, yeah, there's nothing else really to say. I don't even want to ramble at the start of this one. But if you're seeing this part two first, I've done the reaction to part one. I don't know if I'm going to remember to leave the links in the description or like have like a pop up here. But yeah, if you go onto my channel, you can find part one will be under this part. And yeah, that's about it really. But let's just get into this one. I mean, I've not really got much else to say. I'm going to go back a little bit just so I can sort of recap on the last few things he said. I remember he was talking about like how in the Great Basin areas, or the Great Basin's new state possibility, if that was a possibility, they would like consider stopping people from being able to use water for unimportant things like your lawn or water parks and all these different things, which is crazy to me. I wouldn't have even considered that, but I guess it would make sense if that would be the case of what would have to happen. But let's just get into this one, man. Let's see what else he has to
Banning
say.
most forms of farming across an entire state might seem extreme. With a setup like this, the purpose of each state would become far more clear, and agriculture would become the duty of other states with much more access to water, like those of the Midwest. Here, we can see the lands above the Ogallala Aquifer have been consolidated into just two states, based around the Missouri River watershed and the Arkansas River watershed, rather than the 8 it's split between now, allowing for far more swift and decisive action to be taken against its depletion. Consolidating the Ohio drainage basin brings West Virginia into a far larger, more economically diverse state that hopefully be better equipped to handle and improve the poor conditions found currently. Altogether, I don't know about you, but I definitely like this better than what we have now, as everything feels more natural and I could really see some of these developing specific cultures and identities. Of course, that's not to say there aren't any anomalies or issues with this layout. Because the Rio Grande is used to define much of the country's southern border, its drainage basin is cut in half between the US and Mexico, resulting in what's essentially a panhandle that follows the course of the river. The same happened to the Great Lakes Basin, where the placement of Canada's border breaks the southern portion of the watershed into a narrow region extending from Minnesota all the way into New York's Lake Ontario coast. Besides that, however, I think the character of the East Coast has been pretty well preserved, breaking it up into New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the South Atlantic Gulf. Though it should be noted that each of these aren't based around a single watershed, as the rivers here become much smaller than in the middle of the country, and rather each state is a collection of smaller river basins that all empty into a single area. A similar thing happens with California, where it's easier to group all the numerous smaller rivers coming from the coastal mountains than to make each their own entity. But don't worry, what these states lose in their internal connectivity is made up for by the greater accessibility they get through having a coastline. Problems emerge when looking north, however, where we find what's called the Souris Red Rainy watershed. Here, we see international borders again interrupt our plan, only unlike the southern border, this one between the US and Canada doesn't follow the river but rather runs straight through it, leaving only an uneven sliver of the true watershed. Named for the rivers flowing through it, all of these waters empty into Canada, to lakes like Winnipeg and Lake of the Woods, and eventually to the Hudson Bay. This creates a really fractured and not really navigable state that would probably be better off traded to Canada for the rest of some of our watersheds like the Missouri and Columbus. Ironically, our borders used to accommodate this, but the US and Canada actually swapped these lands in order to have a straight line instead.
Oh wow. God damn, that's kind of crazy. One way I could see like this again, the possibilities of this are like very obviously, like it's like I don't know. It seems to be like what would help the country more, I guess, or like help certain people overall. But one of those things is like people have like a real like love for their states, where they're from. Like people from certain states, well, certain people from states will probably love their state more than either their country or just their state will be what they love more than anything really. But like, and maybe the sentiment is like all there. But again, people like from, let's just say Texas, for example, some people from Texas will love Texas more than I love my country probably. And it's crazy how that is the case, but that is how this would probably not work, because the affection for states, the history behind states, all these different things, I could see it not working. But in terms of like, I can't think of the word, like, in terms of, I can't think of what I'm trying to say. I can't think of it, but it's just like in terms of maybe like helping with some of the issues that are going on, like the things going on in Central or the Great Bass in Central America, it would help a lot. But again, I don't know. I can't think of the word I'm looking for, so what I'm saying probably makes no sense.
Overall,
whatsoever.
organizing the country like this seems like it would improve how the individual states and therefore the country as a whole operates, though it wouldn't be without flaws of its own. To tell the truth, I'm not even the first person to suggest this, and actually it was a man named John Wesley Powell who, after personally exploring and mapping much of the American frontier, derived a similar blueprint for Western states all the way back in 1890. Unfortunately, when Powell presented this map to Congress, it didn't get far, and instead we ended up with what we have today.
Part 2, the more states of America.
Okay, well, if you didn't like the thought of radically altering the country's internal borders, well, I don't blame you. In 1912, when these borders became final, the US had a total population of only 95 million, or less than a third of what it is now. If these borders were drawn for far less people, then maybe what we need isn't fewer states, but rather more states to account for the growing we've done since then.
It's the complete opposite
In
of what you
particular,
said.
over the past century, a clear hierarchy of states has emerged. At the top of this hierarchy is California and Texas, the two biggest and, not coincidentally, the two most populated states in the entire lower 48. The sheer size of these states has led them to dominate the field and allowed them to overpower many of their surrounding states, to the point where we have to ask, is it really fair to let some states be way bigger than others? In California, as many as 6 states have been proposed to be made out of one, most recently by this guy, Tim Draper, a venture capitalist who collected and spent $5 million trying to get his idea on a ballot in 2016. Since then, however, he's given up the 6 Californias dream in exchange for a 3 Californias model. Though I gotta be honest, I don't know if these are the same lines I would have drawn across the state. Texas, on the other hand, was admitted into the Union under the provision that if Texas ever wanted to, it could break itself into as many as 5 constituent states, though nothing was written about how to actually break the state up. The most popular way to do this came after the 2008 election from the website 538, which suggested breaking Texas into the Plainlands, El Norte, New Texas, the Gulfland, and Trinity. However, if California is only broken into 3 states, the argument could be made that Texas only really needs to be broken in 2. The easiest way to do this would probably be to use the Texas-Colorado River, which runs pretty cleanly straight through the middle of the state. This would result in a North Texas containing Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston, and a South Texas with cities like San Antonio, El Paso, and Corpus Christi. Austin, Texas, the current state's capital, is actually bisected by the Colorado River, placing parts of the city in both states, meaning they both likely want to find different capitals, while Austin would act as the bridge between them.
That would be an interesting
Of course,
one, for
California and Texas are both well aware of the advantages that come with their massive sizes, and therefore would likely never agree to something like this.
sure. African states of America.
Okay, now over the course of making this video, I couldn't help but be reminded of the video I made about a year ago about the problem with Africa's borders, where I looked at the current issues plaguing the continent and tried to come up with other ways of splitting it up. In that video, I used 3 main characteristics to divide up the whole of Africa: race, religion, and language, which felt like what the European colonists had ignored when they drew their borders. So let's take a look and see if basing the divisions of the country on these factors makes any sense. Starting with the easiest of the 3, English is by far the most widely spoken language in every state, and even in the places where the second most common language, Spanish, is most popular along the country's southern border, still less than 30% of the population here uses it, so to break up the country by any linguistic lines would really just be nonsensical. The same can be said for religion, where unlike Africa, which was nearly perfectly split between Islam and Christianity, 2 notably different religions, in the United States there's no question that Christianity is the sole dominant religion. To see any sort of difference, we need to look at the breakdown of the different branches of Christianity, which splits the country into 3 or 4 different large pieces and a number of smaller denominations. But considering one of the foundational principles of this country was the separation of church and state, it just feels a little backwards to literally define states based on their biggest churches. And so finally, that leaves race, or in this case, ethnicity, which is where things get complicated. Looking at a map of the country by largest ancestry group, we'll find only 6 groups represent more than 5% of the country's population. German, English, African, Mexican, Irish, and Italian, some of which have formed a solid block, while others have more sporadic, non-continuous distributions. However, one thing a map like this is good at showing is settlement patterns. The English were the first to arrive via the East Coast and establish a population, providing a baseline stock across the entire country, on top of which later immigrant groups would build. Which is why today, people of English ancestry don't really form a cohesive territory, except in places where no one else wanted to live, like the Appalachians and Rockies. The Germans primarily migrated over between 1820 to 1910, where advertisements for cheap land drove nearly 6 million immigrants across the Atlantic. Unlike most other immigrant groups, however, the Germans only came over if they had the money to buy farms, meaning most Germans bypassed the cities of the East Coast in favor of buying up all the good farmlands in the Midwest, explaining why today the German ethnicity dominates much of the middle of the country and numbers nearly 50 million strong, or more than half of Germany itself. African Americans have quite the opposite tale to tell, mostly being—
Isn't any more German, not technically German, like people with German descent in America than Germans in Germany themselves? That is insane. That's a crazy stat, I can't even lie.
The slave trade. From just under 600,000 people brought into the country, the African American population has grown to just over 40 million, with their concentration in the South reflecting where slavery was practiced most commonly. At 37 million people, Mexican Americans make up the 4th largest ethnicity and the fastest growing of all the major ethnic groups, on account of the fact that we're still receiving large numbers of immigrants from Mexico. Unlike most other immigrants to the US, which entered the country through its east coast, given their proximity to us, most Mexican immigrants have come directly overland across the US-Mexico border, resulting in a distribution pattern stretching from southern Texas through New Mexico— we really should have seen that coming— into Arizona and finally southern California. Lastly, we have the Irish and Italians, which have fairly similar stories. Both were driven to America as a result of extreme hardships experienced in their homelands, and arrived to the country dirt poor, meaning they mostly stayed in whatever city they arrived in. For the Irish, that chiefly meant Boston and Philadelphia. For the Italians, New York City, giving both groups smaller, more concentrated population centers around eastern cities, but little else throughout the rest of the country. Overall, however, no matter how dominant one group may appear in a certain area, a closer look reveals just how misleading a map like this really is. In Utah, the most English state, only 29% of residents profess English ancestry. North Dakota, the most German state, is only 39% German. Mississippi, the most African American state, is only 38% African. Texas, the most Mexican state, is only 33% Mexican. New Hampshire, the most Irish state, is only 20% Irish. And Connecticut, the most Italian state, is only 18% Italian. What we can see from this is that no single ethnic group holds anything close to a majority anywhere in the country, so using a map like this is just plain inaccurate at describing who lives here. By and large, what we've learned from attempting to split the US by language, religion, and ethnicity is that these criteria just aren't really useful in defining specific regions of the country, showing us that in a lot of ways the country is far more united than we may actually think.
Natural states of America.
Okay, and finally, I couldn't talk so much about redrawing borders without coming up with some of my own ideas about how this all could be done. Now, in my opinion, the best kinds of borders are those defined by natural barriers, as these are often what actually breed many distinct cultural characteristics in a population. Coastal people are going to be different from desert people, who are going to be different from mountain people, who are going to be different from prairie people, who are going to be different from forest people. So what I'm going to try to do is draw some borders based solely on pre-existing boundaries, namely mountains and rivers. For mountains, there are three main lines we can see across the country: the Appalachian Mountains, which section off the East Coast from the Midwest, the Rockies, which put an end to the prairie, and the Cascade Mountains, which distinguish the interior deserts from the coastal forests. For rivers, I used many of the country's most notable and most navigable waterways to flesh out more of the country's interior. The only problem with using rivers is that eventually they break into smaller and smaller streams until you're left with a whole lot of incomplete borders. So it was at this point that I had no choice but to get a little creative and try my best at closing out these gaps to make some actual states. In the end, this is what I got: 28 states plus Hawaii and Alaska, all with borders based on the natural landscape. To be honest, I was surprised by how much parts of this resemble our current setup, with the Appalachians and its rivers carving up the East Coast into a series of mid-sized states, while the many tributaries of the Mississippi River ended up making a collection of much larger bodies spanning the country's Great Plains, ending abruptly where the plains meet the Rockies. These states were probably the hardest to make due to the region's lack of water and therefore rivers to break things up. So I ended up with this large gap in the middle where the Great Basin sits. Finally, the Cascade Mountains of the Pacific Coast made things a little easier, and we ended up with states not entirely unlike our current ones. Overall, after looking at all these different ways of breaking up the country, I think it's safe to conclude that we'll likely never see any of these replace what we have now, so long as this model continues to work, or at least not totally fail. But what do you think? Is this better than this? Or this? Or do you think you could do an even better job at redrawing America's borders? Whatever you think, be sure to let me know in the comments, and send me pictures of how you'd split up the country over on Twitter. If you enjoyed this video, you can thank my patrons, who, besides helping to—
This is a really good video, man. I really enjoyed this, man. I was not expecting it to be this in-depth, man. I really wasn't. Now it's time to read some of the comments. As a West Virginia, I found it very offensive. I found it very what is this sentence? As a West Virginia, I found it very offensive that you said we always find our way to the bottom of the list when it comes to overdoses of obesity. I find it interesting how the 20-some states map is roughly similar to the native US tribes map. It just goes to show how rivers, climate and geography shape languages and cultures in the long run. I love how all these states combine and then there's just California. I want to see the world map become a reality, if only to name the states: True Missouri and Ohio Prime. I think the biggest news here is we're going to have a Dust Bowl 2.0 coming up in the 2030s thing. When you accidentally try to split America into ethno-states. Forest people then continues to show a clip of large city with a couple of bushes. You can tell the map is well made because the lines are very squiggly. As a German, I can say that we redraw on a lot of borders at municipality level. As a European, I can only say that trying to move a border usually results in a few decades of war. Yeah, man. It's probably best to avoid that, to be honest. Other countries, smooth, curvy, and aligned to geography. USA square. People are like the USA is weird, they have weird laws. It's because every state has its own government and laws, and every state can tell the US government to go pound sand on a lot of issues. There's a lot of independence in this union. Yeah, there is really a lot of independence, man. It's crazy like how individual all the states are, man. It is insane, but again, I guess it's what makes the US the US. But hopefully you enjoyed this video. Again, if you haven't seen part 1, links in the description to that, or you can find it through clicking on my channel. And I mean, yeah, until next time, like, subscribe, and peace.